And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar. So I'd like to thank everybody. My name is Sal Gilberto. I will be the moderator for today's presentation, Coordinating Emergency Response, Lessons from the 2017 Hurricane Season. We have a special guest presenter, Richard Serino. I will be introducing him shortly, but let's go ahead and get started. So really quick, because I do want to get to the agendas, to the content as fast as possible. I'll be going over a couple of housekeeping items. I'll introduce our speaker, and then I'll hand it off to Richard Serino to present Coordinating Emergency Response. I'll be coming back on to talk a little bit about strategies to be prepared, and then we'll have a live Q&A. So I'll be going over this again probably several times, but please do submit your questions throughout. I'll go over how in a second, but we will be saving questions until the end. So with the housekeeping items, this is a question that often gets asked, so I'll answer this now. We are recording today's webinar. We will be recording this webinar, and we will be emailing out to all registrants, whether you attend or not. We're going to try to get that emailed out to everybody tomorrow. It may have to wait until Monday, depending on how fast we can process and post the video. But do feel free to take notes, obviously. But if you do miss something or you get called away, or even better, if you want to share it with colleagues because you find the content valuable, you will be receiving a link to the recording. The other thing I wanted to go over, as I mentioned, is we will be taking Q&A. So please do submit your questions throughout, though we are going to save the questions until the end. The way to submit questions is through the GoToWebinar panel. Please do submit your questions via the question area of GoToWebinar. I will be compiling these at the end, and I will pose those questions to our speaker. So again, we do want this to be interactive, so please do submit these questions throughout. And I would like to introduce today's speaker, so Richard Serino. We have Mr. Serino on because he's very qualified to talk to this topic. Not only is he a visiting fellow at Harvard, he's also an advisor at MIT. He was the 8th Deputy Administrator for FEMA, as well as formerly the Chief Emergency Management, the Chief of EMS at Boston. So Richard, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you, Sal.
Awesome. Very much looking forward to your presentation. So with that, I'm going to make you the presenter. And then I will let you know when your slides are up, and you can take it away at that point. Okay, so I'm seeing your slides, and slide shows up, so thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody, depending on where you are in the country. So I just want to take a few minutes before I start to just say thank you to all the women and men of FEMA who have been working almost 50 days at full activation, 4 hurricanes, 6 weeks, 12-hour to 20-hour days for pretty much every employee at FEMA. And I just want to say thank you for all that they've done and they continue to do to help serve the citizens of the United States. Also a special shout out to the first responders, the EMTs, the paramedics, the firefighters, police officers, the nurses, the doctors, the emergency managers, the public health folks that have really made a difference in people's lives for the work that they've done over the past 6 weeks, and they do every single day. So again, I want to, as I'm thanking them, that as we go through this, to think of the victims and the survivors that have been impacted by all of these hurricanes and the disasters over the last 6 weeks or so. So just to keep that in mind as we go throughout some of the lessons learned, review what has happened, to remember the people that have made a difference, continue to make a difference, and the people that are going through hardships right now. So as we go through today, you've already heard a little bit about me. While I was at FEMA, I was at there was over 570 disasters while I was there, and I was at 100 of those in person. But as we look at next year, over the last 6 months or so, but then also the entire 2017, that as of October 6th, there's been 15 weather or climate events that have exceeded losses of $1 billion with a B dollars each. And for the first 9 months of 2017, that those $15 billion separate disasters ties the record that was set in 2011 when I was at FEMA, when there was $15 billion disasters year to date to the same time. I honestly never thought that that record would be broken, and they ended up that year with 16 events in 2011, and 2017 is on track. Since it's tied now, I'm sure we'll get well past that number. So this is a record-breaking year as we start to look at the number and the severity of these disasters, and specifically the hurricanes. In Hurricane Harvey, we realized in Harvey that this was an event that struck and put tremendous amounts of rainwater, 27 trillion gallons of water, 51 inches of rain, a record from a tropical cyclone that hit in the United States. And the amount of damage is estimated to be $75 billion. We talked about disasters that are $1 billion. This exceeded $75 billion. And the number of people that were rescued, if you think of that, 72,000 people rescued. And how that was done was a combination of great work by the Coast Guard, by Texas Public Safety, by first responders, but also by the ultimate first responders, neighbors helping neighbors. That we saw people coming out, the Cajun Navy that was coming out to help neighbors, helping neighbors. We saw the mayor of Houston call out to help. And as we look at through the initial portions of Hurricane Harvey, we saw the life safety, the life-saving issues that came across and how people prioritize that and looking at recovery longer term. And we'll touch on that a bit. But the initial saving lives and the life-sustaining of getting people together, in Texas, they set the model. They were the first one, but how the governor showed good leadership, how the state emergency management director, Nim Kidd, the regional administrator, Tony Robinson, spent over a month together working side by side in the office. And I think that sort of set the tone for how we can work and learn from each of these disasters. The short and long-term recovery of Harvey will actually require a lot of resilience in how the whole community came together in response, but will certainly come together in the recovery as well. And as we look at the next hurricane, and I'll come back to touch on each of these, the recovery and the response shortly, but then we had, right on top of that, Irma and Jose, that as they came across, that they realized the cone that Irma was coming up Florida, right down the middle of Florida. And the cone that, as it was going through Florida, made a big difference, that cone of uncertainty as it covered the entire state. And that caused some issues as far as where to evacuate, what to evacuate, when the entire cone covers the entire state. And as continue to look at the various aspects of Irma, we also noticed that at the same time, Jose, which turned out to be one of the longest running hurricanes in a long time, surpassed Irma that was swirling out. So as eyes were watching on that, hoping that it did not impact the United States, and fortunately it just brushed through New England with minimal damage to homes, although some of us lost some trees due to Jose, so there was impacts up and down the coast. But Irma, as it struck Florida, it was actually the first Category 4 hurricane to touch down in Florida since 2004. And as 37 people were killed in the Caribbean and Cuba, and at least 17 in the United States. The devastation that happened in the Caribbean islands and some damage to Puerto Rico that ultimately laid the ground for Maria, that we'll talk about shortly, really presented some challenges, especially in the Keys, where there was a 10-foot surge. And at one point, there was over 5.5 million people in Florida, Georgia, that were without power. And there were 6.5 million Floridians that were under either mandatory or voluntary evacuations, which caused the surge in a lot of the shelters, which then caused some issues in each one of the shelters of how people were able to be in the shelters for a while. There was a large amount of flights that were canceled. But as going through this, some of the issues that came up was, as always in these, is not only power, but fuel was an issue. In the shelters, sheltering with pets was initially a challenge, but actually turned out to be a good thing in how they were able to respond to that and keeping people with pets as best as possible. There were some issues in getting staffing to the shelters because, again, it was where the path was, covering that entire cone of uncertainty in the state. But neighbors were helping neighbors, and the governor reached out to the whole community to help staff the shelters with some of the survivors themselves, help staff the shelters. There was good unified command within Florida throughout the incident. And one thing that was a real positive there in Florida was EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, that also worked very well in Texas. In Florida, they had a very strong response. They had 39 cents that sent over 3,600 people to Florida to help people with the incident management teams, to help with wastewater, environment, help supporting the EOC, and also received a mobile hospital that came from North Carolina. So it was important to look at how people were able to work together, specifically in Florida and Texas, and how the EMAC worked. That was one of the strong positives that came out of Texas and Florida, is the use of EMAC, one of those big lessons learned. We also, in the Keys, the strong support by the DCO, or the Defense Coordinating Officer, with the state emergency managers and with FEMA, they worked very closely in the Keys and brought in lots of different resources. They brought in everything from the CBs to other folks to actually look and help inspect the bridges, also to give aid and do some of the search and rescue in Florida due to Irma. So as we continued with those, at the same time, as I mentioned, Jose was lurking out and Maria continued to gain strength. Although throughout the period of time, Jose's lurking out there continued to be, as I mentioned, the longest lived hurricane this season. And keeping track of where Jose was going and keeping track of how it was doing, it was more or less the same time that Hurricane Katia, which formed in the Gulf of Mexico, was making some land strikes in Mexico. So at the same time as this is going on, trying to keep track of all the different issues that were going on, looking at how they were working together. And then as Jose lurked and Maria continued to gain strength, and then it struck the island of Puerto Rico. That has caused many different issues over the last number of weeks that this has happened. Maria has been a significant challenge. On the island, as of yesterday, there are over 19,000 federal, civilian, and military personnel that are currently in the islands trying to restore power and get potable water. There's over 36 different federal agencies that are on the ground helping restore businesses. The good news in the Virgin Islands, there's been full restoration of the 911 services in St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. And some schools have started to open in St. Thomas, and St. John, and St. Croix, hopefully in the next few days. And schools opening are always a bellwether of recovery. The sooner that schools can open, the sooner that people can start to feel getting back to normal a bit. All the airports and the federally maintained deepwater ports are open, are fully operational with some certain restrictions. And also the good news is power has been restored to 96% of the hospitals. There's been a lot of federal aid that has gone into Puerto Rico, and there's going to be need for a lot more. Some of the numbers that people can see on the board, that 78% of gas stations are open, 3/4 of supermarkets are open, but unfortunately only 11% of people have power and only 56% have access to potable water. That's going to continue to be a significant challenge in Puerto Rico over a long period of time, because the total infrastructure that was tenuous at best had been completely wiped out. So continue to distribute food. FEMA's and DOD and all the federal partners already 7.5 million meals, over 6.5 million liters of water, and then additional 4 million in meals and almost 3 million liters of water to the Virgin Islands. So as this continues, slowly people are starting to come back in the islands and in Puerto Rico. It's been electrical power is going to be the huge issue. As I said, it's only 11% now, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are on the ground trying to help restore power, but that is going to take months, and we'll touch on some of this shortly, following up some of the recovery and some of the opportunities going forward. So as we start to look, that we realize this hurricane season is not over by a long shot. The hurricane season's not ending till November 30th, and as we were reminded just recently, Hurricane Nate has been able to, hit us very recently. It came Category 1, became a Category 2 as it was coming off the coast. And a quote from Lee Smithson, who's the Director of State Emergency Management in Mississippi, said the damage to Nate was held down in part because of the work done and the lessons learned from Katrina. If that same storm, and I'm quoting, if that same storm had hit us 15 years ago, the damage would have been extensive and we would have had loss of life. But we've rebuilt the coast in the aftermath of Katrina higher and stronger. And I think from that quote is one of the things that's important is as we look at rebuilding across Texas, across Florida, Puerto Rico, and the islands, that we have to take this opportunity to rebuild better. That as we realize that this season is not over, and we've realized the number of people that lost power in Nate and the surge damage to homes was, along the coast, but the key figure in here is there was no loss of life. And I think that as we start to look at this, how we can prepare better going forward is going to be, I think, absolutely essential. And as we look at the response overall to these, all of these hurricanes in the season so far, is that these are all, FEMA had been able to move the resources quickly, especially into Texas and Florida, initially getting that the supplies in there ahead of time, having the states and the regions having that ability to respond to the incident. And we also seem to have learned some of the lessons from before, that we've learned from Katrina. We continue to learn from each of these disasters. We've learned from Sandy. And the lessons learned seem to have been integrated into the planning process and seem to take hold as people are continuing to move forward. The integrated planning, the leadership, and also how people were able to, again, realize that initially Harvey was one of the worst hurricanes we've seen, and we had to, important to realize that it wasn't going to be one and done. A lot of resources were put towards Harvey, but then realizing that right on its back, Irma was coming and hit Florida. So some of the resources had to be moved from Texas over to help out in Irma. Some of the urban search and rescue teams, it's ironic that the Florida teams went and helped the folks in Texas, and some of the Texas USAR teams just a couple of weeks later were in Florida helping them out. So I think the work that the first responders, the USAR teams did was really key and essential. They were able to build in the adaptability into their preparedness plans, and I think that that's, is people have always said FEMA flexible, and I think sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, but I think being flexible and adaptable is one of the keys. As we look just with his Harvey and some of the historic response that went on, we look at what happened in the amount of rain that came, we looked at, but also the medical care that was taken care of, the over 5,000 patients that were cared for, the flood insurance claims that came in, over $600 million, $367 million in low interest loans. And one of the keys that we saw, not just in Harvey and Irma, but also in Maria, is the key that the voluntary agencies have played. The National VOAD, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, how they were able to and continue to step up and assist people all throughout the area, and to look at how they were able to take their folks, whether it's from folks at Team Rubicon, from the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the faith-based groups, Samaritan's Purse, Catholic Charities, the Southern Baptist, over 300 volunteer organizations that truly have made a difference in people's lives, and how we're able to integrate a lot of those assets into the response. And I think that both in Harvey and Irma and Maria, and those are some of the key lessons, is how people have been able to come together, integrating, as we call, the whole community going forward. And one of the things that we saw that, for me, I think, was really seeing the public as the first responder, looking at the public truly as a resource, neighbors helping neighbors. There's no way that government can do this alone, and that's something that we've talked about for years. Some places we've seen it implemented, but hearing the mayor of Houston calling out for anyone with a boat to help out, to save lives, to make a difference. Because as we continue to have these major disasters, and specifically we're talking about hurricanes today, that the public is a key part of public being the first responder, and looking at how the public can help. The Cajun Navy made a big difference in people's lives. We also saw neighbors helping neighbor, as I mentioned earlier, the survivors helping each other in the shelters in Florida. We've seen the neighbors rescuing and taking care of elderly neighbors. There were stories after stories of how that continues to happen. And I think as emergency managers, we have to look at these opportunities of how we're able to bring together and how to incorporate the public as part of the team. That the public, not just in helping out in the Cajun Navy, not just helping out in event at shelters, but also how they can help in being resilient themselves, and how they can be resilient as part of the community. I think we have to look that we have to plan is integrating the public is a key resource in planning. And we have to engage the public in recovery as well, how we can engage them, inspiring to help. We've seen it in the voluntary agencies and having people not only mucking out there and cleaning debris, but continue to donate time and services, but also helping them prepare as well. So I think it's a huge area that we have to continue to do a lot of work on as we bring people together. And as we start to look at recovery, we have to look at where people are staying, how they're able to stay, where they're able to stay. Housing, in recovery, one of the first parts is debris removal, then looking at housing issues, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term. The short-term use of shelters is something that really nobody wants to do, but sometimes we have to look at. But once we get people hopefully out of shelters, whether it's transitional sheltering assistance, which is getting people into hotels, but looking at the use of home sharing, such as Airbnb and others, how we can implement those into how we're able to help people in the short and medium-term housing. But also, I think we have to help set realistic expectations for what the timelines are for people, for power returning, when they are going to get back in their homes, and how we're able to rebuild the infrastructure. And I think, Maria, we're seeing that in the power restoration that, 3 weeks we're still at 11%, but it's totally rebuilding the power grid. So I think as we start to look at the ramifications, we have to realize with the recovery, there's also the health ramifications, the short-term health, the long-term health ramifications going forward. Housing is going to be one of the number one issues as we start to look at various issues. In the shelters, we ran into the capacity concerns, especially in Florida, the number of people that were able to get to certain places. People were, being transported to evacuation centers in Houston. They were coming in the back of, by boat, city dump trucks, and buses, some by foot. but they were met with, when they got there, with cots and blankets and towels and food and medical attention. The Red Cross set up stations to serve as, a place where people could get some refuge. At one point, there was over 8,800 people inside one of the shelters that had a capacity of about 5,000. But I think creating the sense of stability for people is essential. And I think, as Brock Long said early on in Harvey, is once we moved them, we're able to get them from different areas. We got them into shelters. But shelter is a very heavy lift. We need to get people out of shelters into temporary housing and into their long-term housing. Texas has taken the lead on a lot of opportunities for housing. And some of the opportunities that they're looking at is how to look at the federally funded, state-managed, and locally implemented process where a lot of the housing issues will be now done from the state level and the local level. Looking at multifamily lease and repair, offering direct assistance to repair or improve the existing multifamily homes, such as apartments, in order to provide more housing for survivors. In those, 3 units or more, looking at getting those on, looking at direct leasing, how local governments can lease property that would typically not be available to the public, such as corporate lodging, etc. Local governments looking to get into leases on behalf of individuals, so various types of housing that may be available. Eventually, if needed, looking at the manufactured housing options, such as mobile homes or recreational vehicles, but trying to give direct housing so people can keep in their houses on their lands, working with the local officials for permitting that's going to be necessary. And Texas, again, has taken a lead on that and how to do some new innovative opportunities that present themselves in a crisis. We've also seen the issues that we saw in Florida with the elderly and nursing homes and some of the tragedies that people have lived in, and unfortunately some people have passed away in. And we have to look at nursing homes and places where elderly live as not just special populations, but areas that, as we start to look at new regulations, to make sure that they're enforced, to make sure that the compliance, although it varies state to state, but understanding that staffing issues are there. And as emergency managers, we have to realize that these are places that we have to look at. Even though, we've had over 2,000 nursing homes that have been cited in the past few years, we have to really keep on top of that, because it was on a daily basis, understaffing of nursing homes is a major problem, becomes even more dangerous when the weather hits. So we have to have not just plans in place, but to make sure that those are in effect. And a lot of times the emergency preparedness plans, if they're in place, are also sometimes inadequate because they should just use boilerplate legalese. And they have to be more in depth than this. We have to have more opportunities to implement in the executions of these, because we've seen both in Harvey and Irma that we have to take these and put these into practice. We've also seen a lot of public health ramifications after these disasters. We've seen taking care of people getting good drinking water, power early on makes a difference. Some of the public health ramifications, not only from drinking water and public health, but also the injuries that occur as people are starting to start during the recovery process, everything from chainsaw accidents to trauma that people serve, to working in, the heat and humidity that people are dealing with. And pretty much, as you start to look at most flood disasters, also a public health disaster. Sometimes we see, the critical shortages that happen with food, medicine, people that have serious chronic disease, sometimes are having to make difficult decisions between their medications and do they have refrigeration to take care of those. So it presents a significant public health challenge. We've seen this every time from Katrina and that environmental illnesses that'll happen, outbreaks, that'll intensify sometimes after a disaster. And Harvey and Irma, we didn't see as much as some people predicted, which is a very good thing. So getting quick access initially is a good opportunity. We also have to look at some of the mental health risks that come along with disasters. And, you know, we see a 782% increase for risks for mental health emergency visits after Hurricane Sandy during the blackout. This is not a new thing. We didn't learn this just from Sandy, but we have to realize that the hardest thing for people to adjust after disaster is accepting the new normal. People like the routine of the everyday life, but disasters by their very nature change routines. And a lot of people have difficulties with that change. The schedule changes that, you know, family have activities and they have driving patterns of kids going to school, people going to work. And so much change at one time can be debilitating, and quite often it breeds anger, and we see that quite often. We see increases in domestic abuse, child abuse, suicides rate rise, and lives can begin to spin out of control. And it's pretty common that we see these in most disasters, and understanding that this is happening is key. Counseling is often overlooked as an assistance in disasters, but it can actually sometimes be the most important aid people can receive. Oftentimes they choose not to. And it's often said that the stuff, quote unquote, can be replaced. But we have to remember that people are tied to their stuff, and seeing it, you know, strewn out on the front lawn, across the street, nowhere in sight, is something that can be emotionally difficult. If you think of yourself and take the entire contents of your house are gone and they're strewn on the front lawn or across a neighbor's yard, that can be emotionally difficult. And that's why support systems are critical at this stage. Family, friends, churches can really help build that gap to a new normal. And those who don't have the support systems do succumb at a higher rate. And just talking about what's going on with people, just talking to them, listening to them throughout the recovery. So just listening, being there, and sometimes take the venting. And sometimes the first responders and folks for FEMA are the recipients of that venting as well. And sometimes the hardest part of the disaster is not the first 100 days, but what goes beyond that in mental health issues, because the reality sets in, and this can and will be very hard to deal with. Responders should also be aware of their own mental health because of the impact of what they're seeing, the hours that people are working, and how I open this, of the people who have gone, 6 weeks without a day off, working 12 to 20 plus hour days because they want to help. But it's incumbent upon the responders, incumbent upon all of the supervisors and bosses as well, that we have to keep an eye on the workers, because they can become very stressed as well. And I think we have to, as we continue to think about the workers, we start to continue to think about that, we also have to look at how we can help rebuild healthy, resilient, sustainable communities. I was very fortunate to be part of the Institute of Medicine group that came up with this document after well over a year's worth of work of how to rebuild a healthy, resilient, and sustainable community after a disaster with the National Academy of Sciences. And in fact, as we start to look at this, after disaster, it's an opportunity to rebuild the community better. And we have to look at how to do this. I'm not going to go through this 583-page document, but as recently as yesterday, in the New England Journal of Medicine, the tragedies remind us that these natural disasters happen and that no community is immune to them. And we can use these disasters, and we should use these as a vivid call to action for the health, social service, emergency managers, and the public safety personnel to work together to ensure that we engage in planning to help rebuild the communities and rebuild these communities better. As tragic as these hurricanes have been, these offer an opportunity for us to rebuild better. And this document gives a very good opportunity for people to look at some of the lessons learned, lays these out in very specific ways that we can look at how you can facilitate the whole community through the process, how you can advance and leverage social networks. I'm not talking social media, social networks of the community, how we can establish pathways that health information can inform recovery. This is an opportunity for the health community and the emergency management community to work together. That we have to look at how we can use the health information technology infrastructure and national disaster behavioral health, how we can use those with emergency management to help rebuild the communities better. There's an opportunity that we have to look at this as we rebuild, whether it's parts of Texas, Florida, or a large portion of Puerto Rico, that we have the opportunity to build a healthy, resilient, sustainable community. And it's a matter of bringing all the people together. And that lays out a blueprint in order for us all to be able to do that. We have to also realize that in communications, in politics, one of the things with communications, we have to look at how important social media is. We have to also understand that there's large parts of people that initially are going to be without communications. They may not have cellular service, they're in remote locations, but how do we get information to people in the times of crisis, in a disaster? Initially, people may have a little bit of battery power left if they have cell sites and able to communicate, but utilizing social media have been a key way to communicate. The social media aspect worked very well, especially in Texas and Florida. And Maria, because Puerto Rico, a lot of the cell sites were just knocked out. And we've seen all the unfortunate pictures of people trying to find a cell site that works. But we also have to look at how we communicate and how people perceive the communications as emergency managers, how we're able to look and continue to work together. The other thing is there's a lot of innovations that are out there. One of the things that during a disaster, looking at technology and innovation, that never let a good crisis go to waste, that you are going to be able to do things in a crisis perhaps you've been trying to do for a long time. You have the opportunity to be innovative, to try new things, how we're able to continue to get messages out. And for people who are not on social media, they should be on social media well ahead of it. You have to be able to, create your narrative. The narrative is something that you have to be able to manage, something you have to be able to have a presence on and be aware of what the narrative is, in determining how you're able to not necessarily manage the narrative, but certainly become a voice and have that voice on social media and have that voice in regular media as well. Texas used live Twitter feeds that they gave updates in many different ways. This is just a screenshot of some of the things that they were able to do from many different places, keeping track of all the social media that's going on. And we also have to realize that during disasters is also sometimes we're dealing, in fact, most of the time, we're always dealing in a political environment. But being aware of that in your area, seeing how, the governor, this is Governor Abbott in Texas, and how he took a very key leadership role, initially speaking to the public, I was going to say daily, but hourly at sometimes, being informed in which decisions that he needs to be informed of and which ones he doesn't have to be. But political folks are, can be critical allies, not just in the response, but also in the preparedness and especially in the recovery stages. There's a quote from Governor Haley Barbour when he was governor of Mississippi. He had said, you know, for a politician to give up power is an unnatural act. So understanding the politics of a disaster, understanding the politicians, but always at the same time putting the survivors first and reminding the politicians that politicians have a role to play and help define what that role is for them. As we continue to look at some of the lessons learned over the last 6 weeks or so from these disasters, I think one of the keys is to remember to keep people first. Keep people first in what we do and the survivors first. It's very easy to let that slide, to forget about that. To understand what the priorities are. Initially, those priorities are always going to be life safety and life-sustaining issues. Those are going to be the absolute key. Then after the rescue, then we have to look at, you know, making sure that they have those life-sustaining, the food, the water, sanitation, to keep people healthy, give them somewhere to stay. But understanding that after that, it's, you know, we have to look at debris removal. We have to look at housing and how to get cash flow back into the system, how to get the tax base back up and running, how to get people back to work, and how to bring together that whole community, having those relationships. And the relationships are absolutely key. How we're able to bring in the business community, because businesses can see disaster as an opportunity. For example, Elon Musk has been talking about how to make them fossil-free in Puerto Rico. Well, he did it on a smaller scale in one of the islands off of American Samoa after the tsunamis, of how to bring in batteries and solar power to become completely sustainable. Businesses in the private sector are going to be key to any part of a recovery, in developing that and having them engage the community and bring together the entire community. I mentioned the faith-based community earlier. I mentioned the nonprofits, that this is not going to be just a FEMA or a federal or state or local government. It's the entire whole community that's going to help bring people together. We've seen people that the generosity of bringing services and non-perishable goods. We've seen people mucking out homes. We need to do that. We need to continue to invest in resilience and infrastructure in the communities, but also the private sector as well. As we look at communications, we have to look at how it's not of, well, I should use social media. It's a must in this day and age. It's not just sending information out, but it's also listening. It's listening to what the people are saying, both in person, but also what people are saying on social media, and how to react to that, and react to that quickly to debunk any rumors that may be happening, and to also keep people engaged. We also have to look at that leadership really matters. Leadership matters, and what we've been able to see in these instances, that strong leadership at both the local level, the state level, really matters and will help the federal. And FEMA is there to support the governors of the states, and that's FEMA's role, is to support that. But leadership really matters. And we saw, as I mentioned in Florida, but EMAC was key. The Emergency Management Assistance Compact of what people were able to do was absolutely essential to how people were able to work together. Managing donations, when in-kind donations are not kind. I stole that headline from Center for Disaster Preparedness, CDP, that they were, a lot of times people donated stuff, and that's not what's needed. Cash is needed. For people to go, if they want to donate their time, or an agency to donate money to, the Red Cross, or let's go to NVOAD. In housing is always going to be an issue after a major disaster, but this is an opportunity for us to think creatively, to rebuild better, to rebuild smarter, to look at the building codes that we have, to look at the how and where we rebuild, but also to be more resilient in how we're able to build. I've mentioned crisis as an opportunity for innovation. We've seen that is MIT is doing some work in housing. There's areas that are looking at monitoring debris, looking at how we can start to use artificial intelligence and machine learning on how we're able to look at where the disasters and the effects of disasters are, and understanding the politics of disaster and what we're able to do. And I've just given a couple of places of how and where people can go to help. The National VOAD, as I've mentioned, you can donate to Puerto Rico, donate to the U.S. Virgin Islands. There's websites here that'll be available for people to look at, and for people to get more information as to what's going on with each one of these disasters. FEMA has a website and links to go to each one of these and find out specifically what's up to date for the response for each one of these. And that's one of the places that people should go to get the latest information of what's going on. And as a final thought is recognizing the need for a more robust investment in the integrated resilience of individuals, communities, the private companies, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and all the government. And as I heard Tony Robinson, the Regional Administrator of Region 6 say, don't be afraid to succeed. So thank you very much. I look forward to answering some questions. I know Sal's going to take it for a few minutes and then come back to answer some questions.
Yes, thank you, Richard. That was great. You are correct. I'm going to take it back really quick. So again, to our audience, we will be taking a Q&A shortly. So please do continue to submit your questions. We have lots of questions. So I'm going to try to get through this portion of the presentation quickly and get to as many questions as possible. But just wanted to come on because as you saw Mr. Serino's presentation, I think it's pretty clear that preparation is key. Being prepared is key. A lot of the recommendations that he's making, a lot of the lessons learned are not things that can be implemented on the fly. So, I wanted to talk a little bit more about severe weather preparedness, and really, here at Everbridge, we view it that there's 4 areas we think are really key to severe weather preparedness, and it's get the best assessment, make sure that you have your situational intelligence. The second one is that every second counts in an emergency, so be able to execute quickly and accurately. Make sure that you can coordinate your response teams and make sure that you can inform those that are affected. So, when you're talking about keeping residents safe and you're talking about this coordination, how can you actually achieve those 4 items? One of the keys is to automate the process. Automate so that you can send messages that are both accurate and delivered quickly. So you don't want to send out information that is inaccurate. You don't want to send information that's too late. So really, automation is the key to the speed and accuracy of the communications. Location is very specific. Different locations have different needs. Different locations have different informational needs. So make sure that you can quickly, segment your coordination, your communication via locations. And it's really important when you're trying to send out information, when you're trying to communicate. We call it multimodal communication, and what that basically means is send out as many channels as possible. The more channels you can use, as we mentioned in this presentation, social media is a channel, email is a channel, SMS is a channel. You just increase your likelihood of messages being sent. And you want to be able to communicate what needs to be communicated to both responders and stakeholders, and those are different communications. And when you're trying to get in contact with your responders, when you're trying to allocate resources, it's really important that you're able to segment those resources based on skill level, based on their location, on their responsibility roles, things like that. So that's where Everbridge comes into play. Everbridge is a enterprise software application. Our primary goal as an organization is to keep people safe and businesses running. Now, how do we do that? Well, it goes beyond just severe weather. We are a software as a service that is used on many types of events, not just severe weather, but severe weather is definitely something that a lot of our customers use. And we service more than 3,200 different customers across industries, across a wide range of industries. That's what's given us the power and experience to know how to service these customers, know what their needs are, know what they're looking for in a communication and coordination software service. So really quick, want to get through that. Now we'll open up to Q&A. Just wanted to leave these up. There's some additional resources coming up, or there's some additional resources available for severe weather. So I'll leave these up as we ask questions. But we do have a webinar in November talking about the winter weather forecast. So if you want to go to this, the bit.ly link there. We also have a webinar coming up in January about building emergency messaging into your all hazards weather plan. That is actually being presented by our technical account manager for Florida. So someone who is very much involved in what happened in Florida and can give some firsthand experience there. We also have a severe weather tip sheet that's available. So with that, don't want to take up any more time. Let's get to the questions. So Richard, the first question I had, this has kind of come up in a couple different versions, but I'll try to summarize a couple of these, but what indemnities, protections are there when you're asking the public to become a responder, both for them and for the organization that's asking them to kind of help out with the response, as well as what kind of screening is there when you ask the public to become a responder? If you ask them to go to a shelter and volunteer and that sort of thing, is there sort of screening that's set up? How is that communicated out?
A couple of good questions, and I think the part about having the public be identified, I think one of the issues is most states, and I can't speak for all, have some sort of Good Samaritan laws that people are protected by those. And a lot of times we're asking neighbors helping neighbors. Is people usually has not been an issue. In fact, in many years, and I'm not saying none, very few times has an individual who's actually gone to help somebody in a crisis, and we saw tens of thousands of people doing this, very rarely any legal action is taken because people are helping people in a crisis. So I think that's number one. The second part of the question, remind me of the second part. Oh, yeah. The screening at shelters. That's why going through the VOADs and going through the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, going to people at the Red Cross, doing that ahead of time really makes a difference, is having people able to do that. Some of the things they were asking people to do in the shelters were sometimes simple things like handing out food, being there, handing out blankets. In the crisis, when there was nobody to help each other, nobody there at the shelters, very few people to staff it, that's why having people take some personal responsibility, preparing ahead of time and looking to get some basic training, become part of the team through the national VOAD. These are issues that people in the communities can look at too in advance during their planning stages and address those issues, so when the public comes, they can answer those on a local level, because each state has their own different laws and regulations on how to do that.
Perfect. A couple of people are asking, will they be able to access this presentation after the fact? And the answer to that is yes. We are recording today's session. We will be emailing that out. Also, just want to remind everybody, you can continue to submit questions via the GoToWebinar interface. We'll try to get through as many as possible. One question, Richard, I'll just read it verbatim because I think it's fine. With all these hurricanes, how are landfills being managed? There are thousands of tons of debris to deal with. New policies, new landfill regulations. How is this all being dealt with?
Again, this is mainly a local issue, and it varies very much, sometimes state to state and sometimes county to county, depending on the state you're in. And then also what each, I know in Texas, I heard the governor say that they were looking at waiving certain regulations that were in place. The governor has that authority in Texas. I was in the room when I heard him tell people that they were waiving certain ones in order to make sure they could remove debris quickly. They had different staging areas they would take it to, then filter it out and decide which ones to go where. But again, Texas has that authority. Other states, the governor may or may not. They were not letting certain regulations get in the way of clearing debris and having people move back in. So again, that's part of the planning process. These are lessons that have been learned. The governor knew what authorities he had and put those in place in order to expedite the debris removal.
Sounds great. I have actually a question about that'll handle. Does Everbridge provide templates we can upload into our system to use? So I don't know if that is for an existing client or someone who does not have Everbridge, but the answer to that is yes. If you're an existing client, you could talk to your account manager, but we do have a lot of templates. We have basically bundles of different types of templates. So I'm not sure exactly which ones would apply to you, but we have kind of a wide library to choose from. We'd be happy to discuss that if you're not an Everbridge client. And one of the things that's stopping you is that you'd want to know if that is available. The answer to that question is yes, we do have that available. So you've mentioned EMAC a few times. I'm just trying to find this question. The question was basically, do you just have any best practices for working with EMACs? So actually I have right here. Can you comment on any strengths and weaknesses related to the national?
Oh, we lost you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, Sal, we lost you.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Perfect. Yep. Sorry. Can you comment on any strengths and weaknesses related to the National Guard Bureau's EMAC support to affected states? Any best practices or lessons that you'd recommend?
I think that, both in Texas and in Florida, we saw how the EMAC worked very well. I mentioned the states that provided support, 39 states. And National Guard assets played a huge role in sending in additional helicopters, planes, troops, specialty areas. In each of those played a key role, the National Guard, how they were able to assist in bringing those together, and how they were able also to work under the dual status command, having a very clear start date for when the dual status command started, when the dual status command ended as well, making that very clear. So we're able to use both Title 10 and Title 32, both active military and National Guard assets.
Great. And again, a reminder, everybody, please continue to submit these questions. I know that we're running short on time, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So my next question is, I saw in one interview that FEMA was using a special needs registry during Harvey to find and help people with special needs. Is that true? Do you believe that having a special needs registry is beneficial?
I can't say whether they had it or not. I don't know whether they had that up and running. Keeping track of people with functional and access needs is key, and shelters are mandated to have open to everybody with any sort of functional and access needs. So I also know that in different localities, people have the ability to register, self-register. So if they need help ahead of time, they can register ahead of time. Most current 911 systems have that. There's some new technologies that people are also able to register and reach out, so people can, if they have medical issues or they're on certain medical devices, that people can be aware of that in the community so they can go out and assist. And I think having that information and for people to self-register is key. Utilizing whether it's other data, CMS information, but that's shared within the public health arena and can be shared past that for life safety issues in a disaster.
All right. So if you allow me to restate, you're saying that you do find that, some database, or at least the availability of that information, is definitely beneficial, and that if you are an emergency manager and you're not aware of any database like that, to contact your state or your county or your locality and try to find out if that is something that already exists?
Right. Reach out to for the health data, reach out to their public health, for the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response at HHS, to see if they have access to that, if they can have access to that. But all this should be done ahead of time, not in a crisis. And as I said, to check with your local 911 system to see if they if people self-register for that also ahead of time.
Perfect. And I know that we're at the top of the hour. Do you have a few more minutes to try to get through some of these questions?
Sure.
Perfect.
A couple more.
Yeah, we'll try. We'll do one or two more. So this is a good question, and I think can lead to kind of a broad answer. In simple words, are the poorest areas affected most? What does the vulnerability assessments have to show about that?
Well, I think it's, vulnerability assessments, no vulnerability assessments. We know that in certain areas, in socioeconomically depressed areas, that those are always going to be areas that we're going to have an issue after a disaster. It's something that we know, something that we look at in how we prepare and look at those areas and have resources going to those areas. So understanding that the socioeconomically depressed areas are usually places that we're going to have some of our biggest challenges, and those a lot of times where a lot of resources can go, not just during the response, but also where we need to put efforts in the preparedness arena as well to address some of the issues. So during a response, it doesn't become the issue. And as I mentioned earlier, is how we can look at having building a healthy, resilient community is absolutely key, and how we're able to do that, and looking at those areas and what we need to do in those areas to help develop that.
Perfect. Let me ask one last question, then I apologize to everybody who's asked questions. We could try to address them via email afterwards, but I think this is actually something that's come up a couple of times. How can we take these lessons learned and adapt them to other natural disasters, such as the wildfires in Northern California?
I think that's a great question. And I think the lessons learned from each disaster is going to help us in the next disaster. Evacuation, whether evacuation from flooding, from an oncoming hurricane, or from a firestorm, how we evacuate, when we evacuate, are very similar. Obviously, the where in which direction is going to be incident specific, and that's why listening to the local authorities on evacuation is key. But we also have to look at overall lessons that learned. We've seen an arc of improvement since going back to whether it's Hurricane Andrew or 9/11 or Katrina, pick a point in time. But we've seen a very much arc of improvement that has gone pretty much straight up on how people have learned the lessons from before. Did I say 100%? No, I would love it to be 100%. But we've certainly seen an improvement from lessons learned, how we've changed, how we've adapted to bring in the whole community, how we've adapted to bring in businesses as part of the team, how the whole of government, not just FEMA, not just federal government, not just state government, not just local or tribal government, but how we've been able to link them all together during the response. Are we at 100%? No. Do we still have a ways to go? Yes. But we continue to learn the lessons and continue that arc of improvement.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And just from an Everbridge perspective with some of the preparedness items that I was discussing, it's as Richard has mentioned, all the preparedness needs to be done beforehand. You can't be in the midst of a disaster trying to check some of these boxes. It is interesting that, there's sort of a lead up to a hurricane. There's some warning usually, although it's uncertain. We talked about the path of the cone of uncertainty in Florida and how it actually it kind of deviated from its most likely path. I know that threw a kind of a monkey wrench in some of where they were sending shelters. Something like a wildfire, you have, the timeliness is even, I would say more important because there's very little warning on a fast-moving wildfire. Kind of same thing with tornadoes, right? Tornadoes are a less predictable event than, say, a hurricane. So, but totally understood that a lot of the preparedness lessons and the coordination lessons are interchangeable amongst disasters. With that, I apologize to everybody who asked questions because there's tons of great questions here, but we are out of time. Don't want to keep our speaker any longer. So the first, I'd like to thank the audience. It was very interactive. I'm very glad that it seems like there's a lot of value being gotten out of this session. I'd like to thank our speaker, Richard Serino. So Richard, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you.
All right, and as I mentioned, this has all been recorded. We will try to get that out to you tomorrow, maybe Monday at the latest, depending on how fast we can process the video. Everybody, good luck in your severe weather preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you.